What's up, everyone, and welcome into another episode of Goal Line Dynasty. Today, Tyler and I are not doing a mock draft. We're not talking about specific players, but we are going to give some advice for those Dynasty Rookie Drafts that are coming up. There's a lot of data points on rookies. There's a lot of talking heads for these rookies and what to do and what not to do. And we kind of wanted to take this video to talk about the actual rookie draft itself and kind of how you as a dynasty manager can navigate it in the most successful way. But before we get into the video, Tyler, how we doing, buddy?
I'm good, man. And it's the time of year where it's time to stop guessing, and we're a couple days away from having some real information from the draft and these landing spots and all that stuff, when we can really have definitive mock drafts and really get into the rookie draft season. So it's gonna be fun to just talk about general strategy, and then eventually get into some specific situations. I'm excited to go through some of my teams, see what you think. You're actually in one of these leagues, so I hope we go through that one, and I can get a double-edged sword there, and or kill two birds with one stone, whichever saying really applies better. But yeah, these are just general strategies that we think have worked over the years, and we think that it's important to just keep these things in mind and don't go stir crazy over these names, and just sticking to the process.
Exactly. And that's kind of what it all comes down to is you got to head into it with a process in mind and kind of know how to roll with the punches, which we'll get into in a little bit. But let's jump right on in. We got 6 different, quote unquote rules that I think everyone should follow as they go through their rookie drafts. And Tyler, if I miss anything, feel free to just shout it out. Just because we don't have it in our show notes here, obviously, any advice you got, throw it out for the people. But the first one is going to be very simple, extremely simple. Most of you don't even need to listen to this because you should already be practicing this. Know your league rules, right? So one of the situations that we're going to take a look at the end of this video is actually from a PPC league, right? Points per carry league. So you got points per carry in some leagues. You got tight end premium in some leagues. Is it 0.5? Is it 0.75? Is it full point tight end premium, right? Is it super flex versus 2 QB? I know this sounds really, kind of like elementary stuff when it comes to dynasty football. But when you're looking at Fantasy Pros or PFF or DLF or wherever you get your rookie rankings, if you don't make your own, you got to keep in mind that this is probably just for a standard league. Like, you're going to have to rearrange some of those rankings to fit what might work a little bit better for your league. Like, Tyler, I know we'll talk about this a little bit later, but you've brought this up on previous shows that we've done, and you've brought up just how high should we consider taking Jaden Daniels in a PPC league, right? Because getting an additional point per carry on top of, his 6-point passing touchdowns, his 6-point rushing touchdowns, his 0.1 per rushing touchdowns, I mean, that goes a long way. So I know it's a long-winded way of saying just know your league, but you got to know your league and you got to understand your rules. I think that's very important and kind of underrated for a lot of people.
Yeah, and I think you kind of brought up 2 points, though. Number one, just being active, and number two, sticking to the format. It's something that I kind of obsess over. I think it's the most important thing when you're looking at a dynasty roster. If it's tough to give somebody advice if you're not looking at the format and the scoring, how many starters, like all of those things, bench spots, all that stuff. Is it best ball? Is it a lineup league, super flex, one quarterback? Like, you need all that kind of context to really evaluate the kind of moves you're making, because like you said, like Jaden Daniels kind of in this PPC league that we're going to talk about, he kind of extends that top tier into like the one of, like, I feel like if I was someone who specifically wanted Jaden Daniels, I'd probably trade up to the 102 to make sure that I get him, because in these leagues, that's a 30 point per game type scorer if he hits his ceiling, if he is the next Lamar Jackson, if Anthony Richardson is the next Lamar Jackson. Those guys get super bumped up. So and then it goes the same thing, like if you're talking about standard leagues or PPR leagues, like running backs are more important in standard leagues, of course, versus wide receivers. Like, you want to flex those guys versus all of that stuff. So there's that point. And then there's also, did you want to chime in on that? Looked like you wanted to
I
talk.
was just going to say, in the year of 2024, nobody better be in a quote-unquote standard league anymore. Like, when was the last time, like, seriously, when was the last time you talked to someone that didn't at least get, like, half-point PPR, right? Like,
It's usually some old head on like Reddit,
Yeah, it's so weird that we call that standard. I think we need to flip it, and like PPR, half PPR needs to become the new standard, and we need to think of some other name because standard is most definitely not standard anymore.
And there was some poll ran. I don't remember. It was on Twitter or X or wherever, or maybe it was just on some content that I was watching that they pulled the chat or something. Like when you talk about a standard league, are you talking about PPR or like no PPR? And I think it was like a 60-40 winning for like standard, meaning no PPR. But yeah, we ventured off topic there. But other than that, you also mentioned just being active in your trade market, and I think that's something like that's important to talk about because not everybody is. Like I'm in a lot of leagues, and in most of them, in all of them, there's at least 2 or 3, 4 people that are almost impossible to get in touch with, and it's like that's just how they want to play Dynasty. They want to forget about fantasy for the off season until rookie draft time comes along, and then maybe they'll make a move or two. Like they kind of treat it like these NFL teams do. They don't make a ton of moves super early on, and like that's okay. That's how they play. You're not going to change them. You're not going to get them like obsessed with fantasy football just because you want to make trades. I just kind of look at it like if they're not making their roster better, like I have the opportunity to. I'll deal with the other managers who are active and see what we can get done. And if they're staying stagnant, I don't know. I feel like they can't have that edge on me. If I make 100 trades over the course of an off season and they make none, there's no way that they're improving the way that my roster is improving. Because I think I make good trades.
I hate it when that topic gets brought up because I don't want to like gatekeep dynasty football by any stretch of the imagination. I mean, if you're watching this, chances are this is probably not you because you're watching a fantasy football video in April, right? But for the people who are in dynasty leagues and just refuse to even look at their trade inbox for months upon months, I hate it, dude. I know it's a little off topic here, but I hate that so much because it's like there's redraft, there's keeper leagues. There's so many other options, right? Like if you're truly going to be in Dynasty, to your point, right? You don't have to be, balls to the wall into it, trading March, April, May, whatever. But you are doing yourself a complete disservice playing Dynasty football if you're not willing to make those kinds of trades. So if you are someone like that, speaking as someone who is not like that, you annoy the living hell out of me. But thanks for watching.
Here's the thing, though, is like, so does it bother you in season when you have a higher chance of winning because there's a team that's racing to the bottom to go get a 101? And now there's 3 teams racing to
I
the bottom.
like my leagues to be as competitive as possible. So like the one league that you're in with me, the first dynasty league that either of us have really been in, right? The one that I commission. I think like 6 out of 7 days a week, we probably see just about everyone talking in the group chat. Now, is everyone as active on the trade, like on the trade market as some other people? Absolutely not. Our buddy Mike, who's in our league, if you're watching this, I'm not talking about you at all because you make a trade every other damn day. But you don't necessarily need to be making trades to be an active member in a dynasty league, and I think it does go a long way. I mean, maybe I'm biased because I'm the commish of it, but it's the league that I have the most fun in by leaps and bounds because it's so active. The most minor thing can happen to someone's player, and you'll have 11 guys just turning on this one guy to make fun of him for absolutely no reason. Like, I don't know. To me, that's what Dynasty is. It's just year-round fun. You don't need to be trading constantly. But the point of this video, because we got a little sidetracked there, point of this video is the next tip. You said it, I said it. It's to be active on draft day. What I mean by that, you don't have to make trades on draft day, but you should definitely be willing to listen. Now, if you're sitting there, especially in Superflex leagues, if you're at 101 or you're at 102 and you've had this pick for the last several months, you being on the clock for 8 hours on draft day, that's probably not going to change much for people. Like if you've committed to drafting Caleb Williams or Marvin Harrison Jr. or whoever you're planning on drafting at the top of your list, feel free to go ahead. You don't need to waste everyone's 8 hours on that draft pick because if someone was going to make you an offer for that, you probably would have received it by now or you would have, some talks. But by the time you hit that 104, 105 range, whether it's super flex, tight end premium, one quarterback, you name it, weird things in just about every league is going to happen by that 5th or 6th pick. And this is when you should really start taking advantage of the clock or lack thereof that you have if you are in those slow drafts. Even if you don't really intend to trade the pick, like if someone's there that like you have to have, like by all means, go ahead and take it. But I think you do yourself a disservice if you don't at least say, hey, this pick is on the block. See what people offer you. See if you can get some counters going back and forth because at the end of the day, these guys are rookies, right? These rookies have never played in the league, and we've seen rookies bust all the time, no matter how much of a sure thing they are, right? And that's actually something that I'm going to go over in a little bit. I actually worked out. Now this is data from the one QB league that I commish, but from 2019 to 2022, I took 4 years of data over the course of all of those drafts and figured out, on average, what the hit rate is. And I think some people are going to be surprised at that, especially in the top 4 or 5, because you think those guys are as close to a sure thing as possible, but you will find out pretty soon that they're not. But either way, you need to be active on draft day. All the best dynasty leagues are really active on draft day, right? I cannot reiterate that enough. At least just explore your options.
Yeah, and I think like you could look at any draft ADP from any recent year. I don't think there's ever been, not that I don't think, I know there's never been a year where the ADP matched up to exactly how the players ended up that year or for their careers or whatever it was. Like it never turns out that the 101 and the 102 and the 103 and the 104 were the best in that order and so on and so forth. Quite often, trading and moving around does end up to be the best option. And I think it's important when you're doing so. Don't do anything too drastic. I don't want to trade back from the 103 or 104 to the 110, right? Most times, unless I'm getting a smash deal, because it's like that 110 isn't really going to be a difference maker for you. Like there's a lot of things that can go wrong. Like it has to be a super insulated deal in order to make those things. And I think you're better off inching backwards, or if you're going to move upwards, inching upwards. You could start at the 1, right? Let's say if I'm trying to move up from the 109, I can start and say, look at the guy at the 107 and say, hey, will you take the 204 and the 109 for the 107? Yes, thank you. Now I have the 107. Can I take the one and I don't know, Tyler Lockett and move up to the 1? Maybe. Let's try it. Right. All right. Now I have the 106, and you can keep moving up that way. Obviously, it gets more and more valuable as you move up the board. But all of a sudden, you look back at it and you're like, wow, I moved the 110, this 204, Tyler Lockett, Tajay Spears, and now I have the 104. Like, wow, how'd that happen? I think inching up is better. You're going to not lose as many of those premier pieces and premier assets. But yeah, kind of going back to what we were alluding to, just as far as like these guys not being as valuable, I just think trading back is almost always the option, because you look at every single draft and it's like not the best profile is the best player. CJ Stroud was not drafted first overall last year. You look back to the year before that, I guess Garrett Wilson would be the most valuable from that class, right? He was not drafted number 1. The year before that, I don't remember, we're going too far back. That was Breece Hall, right? Or no, Breece Hall wasn't the same as Garrett Wilson, right? No. Yeah, same class as Garrett Wilson. But either way, you go back and it's never the best at the top. So
yeah, it's tough to navigate, right? But that's why you got to kind of stay fluid and just know that just because you have the second overall pick doesn't mean it's got a significantly higher chance of smashing as your buddy who has the 6th or 7th overall pick, right? Now, I'm like you were saying, like, don't trade just to say you traded. Like, only do it if it actually makes sense for your team. But there's going to be a lot of deals on the table on draft day that weren't necessarily there for you this offseason. So just kind of keep that in mind. Before we move into the third tip that we have, Tyler, I have a question to ask you, and I want a yes or no or true or false, however you want to answer it. Would you say that a draft pick has the most value when you're on the clock?
Not necessarily. No, that's not really no true ever. There's times where the best offer you're going to get is going to be in February, January. All of a sudden, he gets on the clock, and now that guy who so desperately wanted the 103 and the 109 to move up to get him, now he's looking at the clock and he's like, why would I do that when I'm going to get Jaden Daniels and Malik Neighbors and Brian Thomas to boot? Like, sometimes those offers are no longer on the table. I know for a fact, like, there's been times where I was trying to buy CD Lamb in a 1-quarterback league, and I was, putting up 3 firsts on the table, and one of them was like the one in a class, and it was 2 futures, and, he declined it at the time, and then all of a sudden he put the offer back in my inbox when I was on the clock, and I was like, I don't really think I want that. And it turned out I think the 102 was like Jackson Smith and Jigba, so I regret it. But at the time, I felt like, I don't want to make the deal. But, the point of the story is that sometimes deals just the better deal comes early on. So no.
I would say yes and no, personally. I think, especially this year, if we're looking at super flex leagues, I think if you have a top 8 pick, the answer to that's probably no. Because at this point, anyone who's paying attention to the rookies knows that if you're going to have, an upper echelon tier pick in this rookie draft, it's probably going to be a top 8 pick. I think once you get to 109, maybe this starts at 108. But once you get to 109 and you go to maybe like 204, 205 in that sort of range, I think that's when the picks become extremely valuable when they're on the clock. Because at this point, things have shaken up. Brian Thomas, right? He is currently like the consensus wide receiver 4 for a lot of people, for example, but not everyone is sold. I've seen him as high as 4. I've seen him as low as 10 in some people's rankings because this wide receiver class is so talented that people have a lot of varying opinions. Now, if Brian Thomas goes to Buffalo or if Brian Thomas goes to Kansas City, I almost said if Brian Thomas goes to Xavier Worthy because I'm crossing things up here. But in situations like that, these guys, suddenly 109 has a hell of a lot more value than it did prior to the draft. So I think kind of take that with a grain of salt. I agree with you completely. I think the first 7 or the first 8 picks in Superflex leagues, I think that if you were going to get good value for that pick, chances are it probably would have already came. But I do think if you have a late first to a mid second, I really think that's when you need to start exploring these trades because I think the value is going to go up just because of how things shake up. So I don't know, but
No, I agree. I'll say being in that catbird seat, that's something that strategically, like, I think is a good idea. Like, if you go and look back very early on in the offseason, and still to this day, really, it was believed that the 101 to the 1 was really that top tier because J.J. McCarthy wasn't really believed in early on in the offseason, Now, all of a sudden, that 106 holds a lot more value for someone who's a quarterback needy team, and now they're paying for a quarterback and not paying for Rome Odunze or Brock Bowers or whatever their plan was. So I think like in situations like that, and the same instance with the one of people weren't too high on Brian Thomas until, the offseason really got started. JJ McCarthy were the last of the decent prospects. and now all of a sudden, like you look at the one, people aren't looking at it like, oh, it's a second round running back, a third round running back that we're looking at with a good landing spot. You're looking at it like it's a first round drafted receiver profile. So it just getting that spot that's one pick back out of that tier and hoping that someone bumps into that upper one and really get into that catbird seat, I think is a good strategy.
Yeah. So next tip I want to get into here is use player draft capital and the situation they get drafted to wisely. So, and what I mean by that is think back, I guess it was 2019, AJ Brown was a rookie. AJ Brown was at least like the number 2 or number 3 receiver for a lot of people in their pre-draft rankings. Some people, me being some people, had him as the pre-draft wide receiver 1 because you can see these things coming from a mile away. But then he gets drafted to Tennessee. And even me at the time, I completely deviated from my process. I ignored the talent because at the time, Tennessee, this was even before Ryan Tannehill got there and started doing what Ryan Tannehill was doing, I'm pretty sure. Tennessee was not a very appealing landing spot. And A.J. Brown, this is 1 QB, by the way. A.J. Brown fell to like 106 or something ridiculous. And that shouldn't have happened. So in situations where we're looking at wide receivers and tight ends, I guess this year really just Brock Bowers because the other tight ends, it's anyone's best guess, to be completely honest with you. But wide receivers and tight ends, I try not to pay too much attention to their immediate landing spot. Now, obviously this year, there's likely going to be a receiver that gets drafted to go play with Josh Allen. There's likely going to be a receiver that gets drafted to go play with Patrick Mahomes. And obviously that's appealing. But if whoever lands on those teams, in your whole process pre-draft, if these happen to be guys that you had pretty far down your list from a talent standpoint, don't be afraid to pass them up just because they landed in a good situation. Conversely, when you look at running backs and quarterbacks, I do take their situation a bit more closely. Quarterbacks a little less much because usually offenses are completely reshaped for these quarterbacks. So even if they go into a bad situation, like New England, for example, it's probably not going to make me deviate too much because that offense will then shape around that. Running backs, though, especially in a class where the running backs in this class are kind of scattered all over the place. We don't have any round 1 projected running backs. We might not even have a round 2 running back, right, when all said and done. This is the only situation really where I'm like, okay, how early were they drafted? where did they go to? Because running backs, you have 3-year window, 4-year window. Once running backs hit the age of 26, give or take, they start declining, the majority of them at least, right? They start declining and they start declining fast. So the only one that I would give people a pass on if they're going more for situation than talent would be running back. So, but at the same time, Clyde Edwards-Helaire, all those years ago, right? People were saying, is it going to be Jonathan Taylor? Is it going to be DeAndre Swift? Is it going to be J.K. Dobbins? Clyde Edwards-Helaire was like the RB5, maybe the RB4 for a lot of people because Cam Akers was out there as well. Then he gets round 1 draft capital, goes to the Kansas City Chiefs. Some people, I won't name names because I'll be blaming myself, but some people had the 101 that year. And instead of taking Jonathan Taylor, they took Clyde Edwards-Helaire because they fell for it, right? So you got to take all these things with a grain of salt. Do your own research. If you like the talent, go for the player. If you love the situation, you can move the player up a little bit, but be smart about it.
Yeah, I think it definitely matters for running backs, right? Because we've definitely learned just from playing fantasy that like the situation matters a lot, right? Like there's certain offenses where you just want whatever running back is starting or in the backfield, right? Like you look at like the Rams or like Miami, like you want whoever is going to be the starter there, whoever's going to see snaps because they're just like, I don't know, the running back score a lot of fantasy points. And then you look at situations like the Giants, right? Like I'm not really in. Well, I guess Devin Singletary, I think he'll be what he's been his whole career, but like it's not like he's going to step into a role where it's like, oh my gosh, he's a clear lead back. He's going to finish top 10 because it's like Saquon made that offense. It's like it's very there's definitely spots that matter. But when you look at the wide receivers and quarterbacks, especially like things change, So you look at AJ Brown and he's a prime example of situation change. All of a sudden he blows up and he gets to show off his talent. You look at a guy like Malik Neighbors or Marvin Harrison, who could possibly end up with the Giants at 6 overall. The Giants had pick 6 overall, right? I think or whatever. Whenever the Giants are drafted.
No, they have 6 overall.
Yeah, if he ends up with the Giants, people are gonna hate that. Oh my gosh, he's with Daniel Jones, but it's like if they have a bad quarterback, they're on a short leash already. Like they're drafting the wide receiver to say like, hey, we're giving you the weapons, like you better figure it out, and that's really the situation most times. So. I tried not to take landing spot too much into consideration. I mean, it's hard to tell. Like you look at a guy like Rashee Rice, who was drafted like later on, who bumped in value because he was drafted to the Chiefs, and he ended up performing as a rookie and doing really well. And people are attributing it to him being really good, but we just don't know that that's going to happen again to these other receivers. Just drafting a guy because he fell in a good landing spot and not because he's a great prospect isn't always the best process. I almost mixed up prospect and process. That's a lot of PROS.
No, you're good. Well, before we move on from this one, I will say, just because you brought up the Giants, in 1 QB, I currently have the 101. It's locked and loaded as Marvin Harrison Jr. But I will say this. If Marvin Harrison Jr. does get drafted to the Giants and Malik Neighbors goes to the Chargers or Malik Neighbors goes to Arizona, I'm not saying that I am going to take Malik Neighbors because I'm like 99% sure I'm still going to take Marvin Harrison Jr. just because that's where the talent is, in my opinion. But I would be tempted. Like, that's a situation where I start to listen to offers on, because I don't have the 101 for sale currently because I'm excited to draft Marvin Harrison Jr. But if he goes to that situation, especially in a win now team like I have, I might actually listen to some offers. So, again, take it all with a grain of salt. Chances are Marvin Harrison would be perfectly fine with the Giants, but they also haven't had a 1,000-yard receiver in there since OBJ was prime. So that's kind of discerning right there, right? Anyway, moving on to our next tip. So the next one that I have, Tyler, is don't draft for need, but to an extent. Right. So the one thing to remember when you're doing your rookie draft. Now, if you're a lunatic like me and Tyler, you're going to be starting your rookie drafts like the Monday after the NFL draft is over. Like this time next week, I fully expect to be in at least a couple rookie drafts throughout my leagues. The one thing you have to remember, and Tyler, you've pointed this out a million times on this channel, the season doesn't start until September. You don't need to set a lineup next week. Like you can totally draft best player available at any single position because you have 4 or 5 months to make moves and figure it out for week 1. I think that goes a long way. Now, there's an extent to that, right? If you have a tier of guys comprising of maybe one or two running backs, one or two receivers, whatever, then yeah, whatever fits your team the best, go ahead and take that guy. But don't take someone that you have ranked 6 or 7 spots lower just because you need a running back in April, right? Like it doesn't make any sense. So I'm not saying you always have to go best player available because there are definitely situations. But if you're going to draft at any point for team need, make sure you're not drafting a significantly worse player just because you think you need that for your starting lineup, because chances are that's going to change a whole bunch by the time week 1 gets here.
Yeah, and I mean, like, you look back to last year, right? Like Jackson Smith and Jigba, Jahmyr Gibbs, those guys were in the same tier as CJ Stroud. They got taken over CJ Stroud in plenty of spots, right? So it's like, I don't know. I view these draft picks and I view all of my assets, especially during the offseason, as really just like currency and like tokens. Right? Like, what can I do with them? Right. So like at this point in this offseason, right, you can probably trade CJ Stroud for Jahmyr Gibbs and the 105 and then another future firsts. Right. Like, you probably wouldn't have problem getting some kind of deal like that because that's what a guy like CJ Stroud is worth. So I think, especially when it comes to positional values too, I think it's important to like keep those things in mind, like where the ceiling is with these players, when or what am I going to be able to do with them if they do smash? What am I going to be able to turn this into? How is it going to help my roster? Right? Like, I look at like, and then we talk about it on the flip side, right? Like, so we talk about how quarterbacks and receivers end up more valuable than running backs, and we've talked about it before with tight end, right? Like, what can you do with Sam Laporta right now? What's the best pick you can get for the tight end 1 in Dynasty right now? Probably the 106. You can get Brock Bowers for Sam Laporta. It's really when you're talking about these running backs and tight ends, they're just less flexible assets. So when we're talking about picks in the same tier, like I'm going to lean quarterback, I'm going to lean receiver. But that also being said, I'm not going to take a receiver that I have a tier below a running back. Like, I'm not going to take Lad McConkey, who's drafted in the mid-second to the Packers or whatever, over Trey Benson, who's drafted to the Cowboys, because he's a receiver. I'm gonna stick to my tiers and and play things that way. Like, but it's just that the running backs and tight ends always slide further back, like to the back of those tiers for me.
Yeah, and like a good example is, if we're going back to the quarterbacks, Michael Penix could potentially be a late first-round pick. Bo Nix could potentially be an early second-round pick, right? You might be a little lower on them in the grand scheme of things, but this is a situation where quarterbacks, if they get even round 2 capital at this point in the NFL, chances are he's going to get at least a handful of starts at some point in the next season or two. And you never know what's going to happen there. So, like, if it's a coin toss between taking Michael Penix and, I don't know, like Keon Coleman or something like that, like a wide receiver that you don't have in like that top tier or 2 of your receivers, I think it's perfectly fine. Even if you don't need a 4th quarterback on your roster, I think it's perfectly fine to go for Michael Penix there, because he starts getting somewhat traction when training camp starts. He's going to be infinitely more valuable than Keon Coleman right off the rip, right? And that's just a small situation. There's obviously endless scenarios that you could put this in, but don't stick to what your team needs on draft day. You gotta stay as flexible as possible. And in a lot of scenarios, just take the guy that is the highest value on that board.
And consider the ceiling, right? Like, just consider the ceiling. At the 106, I can promise you, with any 106 that I will own from now until the end of draft season, I will never, ever select Brock Bowers. I probably won't even select Rome Odunze unless my quarterback room is completely stacked. Unless I have a Josh Allen, Kyler Murray, unless I have a Jalen Hurts, Lamar Jackson quarterback room, then I might go Rome Odunze over J.J. McCarthy, because then I might be trying to trade J.J. McCarthy for a Rome Odunze type thing. But but in like almost every single case, I'm going to be taking the quarterback that's drafted top 10. And when I say J.J. McCarthy, I guess I really mean whatever quarterback is traded up for. It's assumed to be J.J. McCarthy right now and ends up with the Vikings and whatnot. So like, I'm going to take him 106 in every single spot imaginable. Because he has the highest ceiling. He's the one who can smash. And then all of a sudden I look back and it's like, oh, he might be my quarterback 3, but look what I can trade him for. I can now trade him for 25-year-old Justin Jefferson, who's not really having a great year because he's playing with a rookie quarterback, yada yada, whatever. That was a bad example because JJ was getting drafted to the Vikings and trading for Justin Jefferson, who's having a bad year, whatever. But you get the freaking point, right?
I get the point. I get the freaking point, as you say. Next tip. We got two more, and then we're going to go over some of Tyler's personal situations in some of his leagues. So the next one I have, this one is an interesting one. One of my biggest piece of advice is to trade away your third and fourth round draft picks. Now, if you're a crazy person and you have a fifth round as well, I do maybe allow fifth round picks in my league. Trade those away as well. I'm going to read some numbers for you, Tyler. And I'm going to put these up on the screen, but I'm going to read these to you. So from 2019 to 2022, and this is one QB, so I'm sure the numbers are a little skewed if we're playing super flex leagues here, but I would imagine the overall percentage is probably just a plus or minus a few points here, right? So this will kind of paint the picture. From 2019 to 2020, this does not count someone as being an elite asset by any stretch of the imagination. This is just purely, could I have maybe put this person in my lineup at least a few times at some point? Right? So this isn't calling out like a top 10 guy or nothing like that. Pick 101 to 104 over the course of 4 seasons, hit 62.5% of the time. Now, in the grand scheme of things, if you say you have a 62.5% chance of nailing one of your top 4 picks, you're going to be pretty pumped about that. But that's a pretty wild statistic to me, honestly. Like, you're picking top 4, you think it's going to be a slam dunk, absolute sure thing. I'm not counting the 2023 class in this, by the way, because it's too early to tell. But you only have a 62% chance of actually hitting on one of those guys. Now, go down even further. 105 to 108, 56%. 109 through 204, 37%. Then when you get to 205 through the end of the second round, it's only a 25% chance of hitting. So even if you have late second round picks, I think you consider selling those for proven assets, because I don't care how good your process is. This is not just my personal data. This is 12 different people in a Dynasty League's data over the course of 4 years. 25% is not a big number. And then as soon as 301 starts, it goes down for the entire third round and the entire fourth round, 12.5% hit rate over 4 seasons. The chances of you hitting on one of these guys is 12.5%. Doesn't matter if it's the 301 or the 412. Pretty similar data between the third and fourth round. So what you do with that information is entirely up to you. But if it's me, I'm doing one of two things. I'm either trading my third and fourth round picks for a proven asset that I might be able to use in my flex spot here and there. Or if I have like the 3, I'll trade it for multiple late thirds or multiple early fourths, because it's probably going to have the same chance of hitting, and at least I get some extra darts to throw at the board.
Yeah, I always like to, just assume that I'm like the dumbest person imaginable in the draft. And when you really lay out those percentages, and they're one quarterback percentages, by the way, right?
Yeah. But I imagine it's got to be similar.
Yeah. I just wanted to double check that. But when you look at those percentages, it just kind of like reemphasizes like either trade back or trade the pick away. When it comes to those third and fourth round picks, a lot of times I just don't want to make them. I want to kick them back to the next year, right? Because now all of a sudden I'm looking at my roster and maybe I need a running back this week, and I don't know, Ty Chandler is going to get the start for the Vikings. So now I have 2/3 and I'm looking at, okay, I can send one of those for a Ty Chandler. Like kicking them back, that's what I really want to use those third and fourth round picks for, is those just to, plaster in and poke the holes in my lineup, or plug the holes in my lineup rather. So kicking them back and getting stacks of them, I think is the ideal way to go. It's not always possible, but when it comes down to it, when I get to the third and fourth round, I typically just go to every manager in my league that has a third or fourth round pick in the next year and see if I can get that, because I'd rather have the asset of a third round pick than actually make that pick. Because again, like, I don't know, I'm not anything, like, you're not special. I'm not special. Nobody's special when it comes to drafting. Like, these guys spend millions and millions of dollars investing into trying to find out who the best players are going to be in the draft, and they still whiff. There's still Jamarcus Russells, and there's still Trey Lances, and there's still yada yada, this, that, and the third, right? And so, trade back, trade away for proven assets. Like, I totally, I'm on board with that when it comes to the third and fourth.
Yeah, because there's always guys in your pre-draft process that fall to day 3 in the NFL draft, and you're like, oh, cool, now I can get this guy with a third or fourth round pick. Chances are, if the NFL faded him for 5 or 6 rounds, it's probably not going to do anything, right? I know people are so obsessed, especially this year, with finding the next Puka Nacua. There's not a next Puka Nacua. I don't think people are grasping just how much of an outlier that whole situation is. Like, people go back and pull his college numbers and look at the college denominators and all these advanced metrics, and they're like, how did we not see this coming? And the reason why we didn't see it coming is because nobody saw it coming, right? If there was some magical formula to find Puka Nacuas, we would have found several Puka Nacuas several years ago, right? Like, don't hold on to these picks thinking you're going to be that guy. Like out of that 12.5%, the amount of that 12.5% that's become Puka Nacua is like 0.5%, right? Like, it doesn't happen. So don't be too obsessed with taking these guys. Now, if there's someone that you absolutely have to have on your team, you're sitting there at the 305, the guy's there. I mean, remember, fantasy is supposed to be fun. Go ahead and take your guy. Like, don't say, oh, Mikey and Tyler told me I have to trade this away and get some more picks for next year and use them as trade bait. You don't have to do that. Which leads me to the final point here, is to just go with your gut. At the end of the day, fantasy, dynasty football, it's supposed to be fun. Now, don't make boneheaded moves for the sake of making boneheaded moves. But hey, man, if you really like Javon Baker and he goes in the end of the 4th round in real life to a really crummy situation, but he's still sitting there at 308 and you were really high on him in your pre-draft process, go ahead and get Javon Baker. Like, that's totally okay. At the end of the day, just trust your gut, trust your process. I know we're here to give advice, and hopefully you guys do heed that advice. But I do recommend everyone form their own opinions, everyone make their own rankings, because what I say is different from what Tyler says. What Tyler says is different from what this guy says. Like, just go with your gut. That's the honestly the best advice that I can give you. That's how you're going to have the most fun playing dynasty football.
Yeah, nobody ever wants to look back and just say like, "Oh man, I missed on my guy because some analyst or somebody who thinks they're an analyst, like, told me not to." My thing when it comes to the late round picks is like, I don't mind buying those guys once they do hit, right? Like once a guy who went in the 3rd, and think about how much a guy really has to do to become worth a good amount in dynasty if they're drafted in the late round. So when it comes to the whole my guy thing, I don't really buy into it, right? Like, I look back at Amon-Ra St. Brown, right? Like, he went on a tear the entire end of the season. I ended up getting him for a singular, future first and a 1 quarterback. I look at Puka Nacua. I own Puka everywhere. I own Amon-Ra everywhere. I've never paid really an absorbent amount for any of these guys. Puka played a full season, and I got him for Jaden Reed and 2 random, 20-25 firsts. It's not like not from tanking teams, So, like, these guys are acquirable. Like, I think the most I paid in season in the super flex for Puka was a first and a second. I got Puka and Jaden Reed in that deal too. So, like, I'm okay buying those guys later. I'm always a fan with these, especially at least with the late round picks to the next year. So that's going to be my combatant on that. But I think in general, when you just say trust your gut, like yeah, you can trust your gut and play fantasy that way, because it's better to be wrong doing what you thought was right than being wrong doing what someone else thought was right.
Yeah,
You're
yeah.
not going to be mad if you do the right thing because somebody else told you to, right?
I agree. I mean, I'm still kicking myself because a few years ago I was not high. Now this whole thing is going to be a moot point at the end because I don't have either of the players on my team anymore. Most of the time, if I draft a player 4 years later, he's not going to be on my team, or 3 years, whatever it is. But I had pick, I think, and this is 1 QB. So somehow Drake London fell to me at 104. Now, I had Garrett Wilson ahead of Drake London in my own personal rankings, even after the draft had happened. But when I was sitting there at 104, there were so many analysts out there that had Drake London, not just as their number 1 wide receiver, but their 101. Like, the fact that this guy was still there at 104 to a lot of people would have been appalling. And I went against my better judgment. I took Drake London rather than Garrett Wilson. Now, obviously, they both have pretty similar value today, so it really doesn't necessarily matter. But you've had a lot more fun having Garrett Wilson on your team the last 2 years than people have had having Drake London on their team the last 2 years, right? So that's just one of those things. And for every good scenario, there's a bad scenario. For every bad scenario, there's a good scenario. Again, it's a moot point to whiff on Garrett Wilson because you took Drake London, but there are a lot of scenarios where I take Clyde Edwards-Helaire instead of Jonathan Taylor, who I wanted, ahead of time. So it is what it is. But Tyler, that's all of our tips. Let's take a look at you sent me over 4 scenarios that you're in, in your rookie drafts. I should have brought some of mine, but I can't give away my secrets too much, right? God knows what I'm going to do with 101 in our league. But first one that we're going to look at here. So your quarterback, Josh Allen, not bad. Your superflex quarterback, Justin Fields, not great.
Wow.
Not great at all. And it looks like all you have in terms of draft picks is the 105. Now, is this the PPC league that you're in?
Yeah, this is a 0.25 PPC. It's 12 team start 10 super flex. So I'm looking through the roster, main pieces: Josh Allen, Garrett Wilson, Travis Etienne, Derrick Henry leading the way in the running back room. Also Deebo Samuel, who gets a slight bump, maybe a point or so, half a point a game for being PPC. But I'm looking at it, and yeah, my flexes are not great, right? Marquise Brown, Adam Thielen, Mike Williams. But the biggest hole now is that Justin Fields is not a starter. So I'm looking at it, and I have the one. I'm really thinking, like, what can I do? And we kind of alluded to it before, like with Jaden Daniels. What can I do to get up to the 103? So I'm looking at the roster, right? I have, Deebo, Garrett Wilson, Hollywood, Derrick Henry, really as pieces that anybody is going to want on this roster, but it's relatively thin. So what would you do in this situation? Would you, pay the piper and move up? Would you sit where you're at because it's a thin roster, or what do you think? Like, I don't know if I can rely on a quarterback falling to me.
It's a really tough situation that you find yourself in here, right? Because you only have 105 this year. The bench is, no offense, but basically non-existent on this team, right? There's not a whole hell of a lot that's going for you. Now, in the grand scheme of things, we replace Justin Fields, let's say, with Jaden Daniels. Let's say Jaden Daniels goes number 2 overall to Washington. That's the current favorite. I think he's like minus 400 at this point. A lot of people are saying that's a done deal at this point. So he's going to have Terry McLaurin, Jahan Dotson, ghosts of Zach Ertz, Austin Eckler, right? It's not a bad situation that Jaden Daniels is going to find himself in year one. But how I look at this is adding Jaden Daniels to this really going to make you that much more of a contender, right? And then on the grand scheme of things, you're going to be giving up, I would imagine, something somewhat significant on top of 105 to move up to either 102 or 103. I would imagine you can get Jaden Daniels at 103, depending on what that guy at 102's roster looks like. But in my opinion, like, I know you're a big Jaden Daniels guy, but depending on what you have to add on top of 105, you might do more damage to this team than anything. Like, are you really going to be that upset if at 105 you have to settle for Drake May? Because chances are Drake May is probably there at 105, if I had to guess.
I think it's more of a fear of, like, am I going to end up having to draft Malik Neighbors, and all of a sudden I'm trying to get myself into the playoffs and into contention, and then I'm putting myself in a spot where I don't have a pick that I can get a quarterback, next year. I'm playing patchwork. I would be playing patchwork here, really just praying to God that I can roster construct and find a backup quarterback that becomes a starter by just loading them into my bench. I think, like, the idea that I only have to move up 2 spots in a class where I know that there's a rushing quarterback that could be a real difference maker in this format. Like, even if it's only for 2 or 3 years, like, if he just gives me like what Justin Fields gave me for those 2 or 3 years, like, I think that becomes worth it, and at least I'm not in a spot where I'm thinking I have to tear the thing down, and I have, like, because I need a tank to go get a quarterback, because I don't want to pay 3 of my future firsts to go get one.
Is it tight end premium, or is it just...
No, it's not tight end premium. So TJ Hawkinson is definitely a piece that can be moved or pared down from, right? But it's kind of like tough, because who necessarily is going after TJ Hawkinson right now? Because obviously he's not going to be playing in the early part of the season.
Yeah, I mean, this is what my advice would be. So first and foremost, to anyone watching, if you're looking to make a trade like this, I know keep trade cut should not be used as like the holy Bible, but in a especially situations like this, you should not use keep trade cut. Because Tyler, do you know what the suggestion is to put on to 105 to get to 103? They're saying throw in Hunter Henry, and that'll get you there. That's not going to get you there in any league. And if it does, you should leave that league or just take supreme advantage of it. It's up to you. I would say, you know what? It's not the worst plan. to throw something on top. If it can be TJ Hawkinson, that's fantastic. If it can be Justin Fields, that's even more fantastic. If you can swing it to the guy that you think Justin Fields will start, you'll still get Malik Neighbors at 105 rather than him getting a quarterback at 103. He can get a quarterback and a receiver at 105. I mean, Justin Fields still has a fan club, and there still is value behind Justin Fields' name. Now, the one thing I would caution is quarterbacks are not necessarily guaranteed. Now, they're on a longer leash than a lot of people, but look at Bryce Young, for example. Bryce Young has an abysmal year behind an abysmal line and an abysmal offense with abysmal coaching. And people are so reactionary that he's not even in some people's top 20 quarterbacks right now, which I think is an issue. Now, with Washington, assuming Jaden Daniels goes to Washington, knowing what we know about this team, they're getting a new coaching staff. We saw Sam Howell be 4th or 5th in passing yards over the first 11 or 12 weeks of the season. This is an offense that is ready to have a quarterback plug and play in it, right? But just know that there is the slight potential that Jaden Daniels could fall off. But chances are Jaden Daniels, as long as he plays like an average quarterback this year, he'll retain the value that you're buying into at the one. If you can swing TJ Hawkinson on top, if you can swing Justin Fields on top, I would go for it.
Yeah, and I'm looking at it now. So the guy who owns the 103, he also owns the 104 and the 107, but his quarterback room, you look at it, and it is pretty darn stacked with CJ Stroud, Jordan Love, and Kyler Murray to boot. So I'm wondering how much it's really going to take to convince him. Right, maybe like a Hollywood Brown, right? Like can Hollywood get me to the one? This guy's rostered. And Murray, right? He's got Olave and Zay Flowers as his wide receivers. You don't really want to flex wide receivers here. You want to have like a third that's decent to throw in on bye weeks. But yeah, he's got a pretty good team. So
and the one thing you can do as well. Now, I don't recommend this to everyone, every league, every situation, whatever. But in a situation like that, he's got a stacked quarterback room. Depending on if you have a relationship with this guy to any capacity, you could be straight up with him. Because he clearly doesn't need a quarterback on the team. You can say, look, this is the move I'm looking to make. Malik Neighbors is still all yours. Brock Bowers, Romo Dunze, these guys are still all yours. This is the move I'm making, right? And hopefully he doesn't take it. I wouldn't disclose that right off the rip. But like if he's taking some convincing, worst case scenario, he says no, and you probably weren't getting Jaden Daniels to begin with at that point anyway, right? So it's worth a shot. It's worth a shot. But Tyler, I want to move into another situation of yours that you're in. This roster, just for the sake of it, you got Kyler Murray at QB1. You got Baker Mayfield at QB2. Bench, largely non-existent. Couple names that I slightly recognize on there. But, an interesting situation you found yourself in. But you have pick 2 and pick 3. What are you hoping happens here?
Yeah, so this league was a dispersal, right? It's a 12-team start 10 PPR. There's no PPC in this format. 0.5 tight end premium. So like you said, looking at Kyler Murray, Baker Mayfield as my quarterback room, and then Rashee Rice, Jalen Waddle, Zay Flowers, Christian Watson, Terry McLaurin as the receiver room. So feel relatively good, or not good, but like decent about their receivers, I guess, right? The things that I took the highest, right, in the startup were actually the 102 and the 103, right? Those were the first things off the board. I actually got lucky in this league, traded away Justin Fields and AJ Brown for Kyler Murray and Rashee Rice before the Justin Fields souring happened. So I feel pretty good about that one. Just getting a quarterback for that price, right? Because I don't think I could have even gotten Kyler Murray for just AJ Brown, or I definitely couldn't have gotten Rashee Rice for Justin Fields. So looking at the rooms, right? Like Kyler Murray, Baker Mayfield, like how do I feel about this room? I don't know. It's dependent on what the guy does at the 101, right? So he's got a pretty open roster here, right? He's got Anthony Richardson at quarterback, and he's got Mike Gesicki in his super flex spot, or he doesn't have a super flex, but he has picks 101 and 105 and 1. So in his head, right, he could be saying, I'm going to take Marvin Harrison and I'll kick the can, right, because his wide receiver room isn't very strong either. T. Higgins is his wide receiver 1 and Allen Robinson is his wide receiver 2. So this guy could be thinking any of these things. He could be thinking, I'm going to take definitely going to take Caleb, and then I'm going to take Rome Odunze at 105 to make sure I get him. Or you could be thinking, I'm going to take Marvin Harrison and then make sure I take J.J. McCarthy at the 106, or hope Drake May falls to the 105 or whatever it is, right? So it depends on what he does, right? So if he goes Caleb Williams, right, then I'm looking at what do I need the most here, or what do I believe in the most, right? I think if he goes Caleb Williams, right, I think Marvin Harrison has to be slotted in here, right?
Yeah.
Like easily, right? Like I'm not going to pass up on him twice, because obviously replacing Terry McLaurin or Christian Watson with Marvin Harrison is going to do a lot more good for me than replacing Baker Mayfield than one of the quarterbacks. So if he goes Caleb, it's a pretty straightforward decision. Marvin Harrison, and then my pick at quarterback. I think it would probably end up being Jaden Daniels in this case. But if he goes Marvin Harrison, that's where I get thrown for a bit of a loop, right? Like, do I want to take a quarter, or do I want to take two quarterbacks, or do I want to take Caleb Williams and Malik Neighbors, right? I have to take Caleb Williams there, but then do I want to take Malik Neighbors over Jaden Daniels and Drake May? Like, what do you do with that third pick, I think is the real question.
I think, the third pick is the most complicated one, because no matter what happens at 101, I would assume it's going to be Caleb Williams with that room that you were saying. So I would pencil Marvin Harrison into this. But Caleb Williams is too much. He's considered too much of an elite asset to pass up. And when you have your QB2 being Baker Mayfield, it's shaky, right? Like, Baker Mayfield had a really good 2023, but there's no guarantee that he's going to have sustained success in 2024. He's been a journeyman quarterback. He's on his fourth team already, right? In his fifth or sixth season. I know he just got extended there, but Geno Smith had a resurgence in Seattle, and now we're looking at him in a completely different light. Like, Baker Mayfield could completely depreciate as an asset in fantasy this time of year from now. So I would say the slam dunk at pick 2 is whoever doesn't go at 1. Right. I think that changes things. But assuming it's going to be Marvin Harrison Jr., I think that you're big on Jaden Daniels. You're also big on Malik Neighbors. That's tough. That's really tough. I genuinely think I would probably go with Jaden Daniels in that situation, because I don't necessarily know if I trust Baker Mayfield to be the only QB2 on this team. And the receiver room, right? Like, assuming Rashee Rice isn't suspended for too long, you replace Christian Watson with Marvin Harrison on this starting lineup. Now, your running backs are a different story. You'll have to address that at some point. But I would rather trade Christian Watson for a running back later on down the line than have to do that with, I don't know. It's tough, buddy. It's tough. But I would say it's either going to be Caleb and Malik, or it's going to be Marvin and Jaden Daniels. I think you got to go 1 and 1.
I think if he goes Marvin Harrison at the 101, I think he's hoping that I go Caleb Neighbors, right? Because then the guy at 1 takes May, he gets Jaden Daniels, one of the two, and he gets the quarterback that he wants, right? He's going to think he's forcing my hand. If I get both quarterbacks, right? If I take Caleb and Jaden Daniels, the guy at the 104 doesn't want to take Malik Neighbors over Drake May or whatever the case is, then all of a sudden the guy's left with Marvin Harrison and Neighbors. Like, I'm holding this guy at gunpoint,
Yeah, but I personally, and this is, just a difference in philosophy, I guess. I always project what my league mates are going to do, but I do not let that dictate my moves personally. Like whoever's picking ahead of me, I try to think what they're going to do so I can get an idea for what I'm going to do on draft day. I'm not making moves saying, oh, I can use this against him later on. I'm making the move that makes the most sense for my team at that moment in time. If it made sense to take Caleb Williams and Jaden Daniels, and you genuinely believe it makes sense to do that, I say by all means go for it. But I just think I like the diversity of getting the QB wide receiver combo rather than doubling down and going 2 QBs, right? Because chances are, if you go 2 QBs here, even if one is Caleb, they're probably both riding the bench for you for the majority of the year, right? Like, Baker Mayfield's probably going to have a better fantasy year in 2023 than a rookie quarterback would be, right? So then you're just relying on the trade market. And I don't necessarily, I don't hate that situation for you, but I just think diversifying the portfolio, getting an elite level receiver, getting an elite level quarterback, 1-1, I think it'll go a longer way than taking double quarterback, just because that's where the perceived value is.
Yeah.
So anyway, I know we said we were going to get through like 3 or 4 scenarios here, but we got through those 2, realized, hey, this video is already an hour long, so we will cut it off here. If you have any scenarios that you think we could be of assistance with, feel free to leave that down in the comments below, and we will definitely do our very best to let you know what we would do. Simultaneously, at the same time, make sure you hit that like button and definitely subscribe. If you found this helpful, if you like what we're doing here on this channel, definitely please subscribe. Normally, this is the time where I say, Tyler, any closing remarks? However, we are having some video options, so I'm just going to go ahead and close it up here. So for myself, for Tyler, for Goal Line Dynasty, we will see you guys next time.